Hi, this is Margaret Maloney, and welcome to the Death Dhamma podcast. Together, we will consider life, death, and impermanence. Because in between birth and death, we lose things, not just our glasses and our keys. We lose identities, relationships, ideas, and more. But what we can gain right now is facing this together, and we will gain freedom, peace, and progress on our path. Everyone, today I am meeting for the first time, as maybe you are as well, Mahesi Caplan, and he has agreed to speak with all of us today about impermanence and death and all of these important topics. And I just want you to know that he is a person who I reached out to him, didn't know him, and right away he said, yes, I would love to talk about this because this is one of my favorite topics. And so you all know that means we are sitting together right now with the right person. And on that note, I would like to allow him to introduce himself to all of us. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, pleasure. So I wanted to come on because this whole topic of death permeates my whole life, and it permeates all of life in my estimation. And it was my reflections on death and dying that culminated in me becoming a Buddhist monk and ordaining and staying for 15 years. So, I've never been afraid of trying, looking at the whole subject, and it goes way back to my childhood. So I assume everybody, in fact, at some point, wonders, what is our destiny? What happens when we die? Where do we go? How to make meaning and sense out of that is not straightforward. I'll describe to you a number of experiences that kind of punctuate the whole sort of process of me arriving at my life as a Buddhist sort of contemplative. I think in early childhood, I remember I often used to sit on the stairs, which is sort of a transitional space, and ask myself the question, who am I? And I would sort of scan into my body to look for some sort of understanding of who I was. And then I would feel a huge kind of electric shock go through my body. And I understand that now probably as being a defensive mechanism, because what I was finding was I couldn't find any interior sense of self that I could locate anywhere. And because that insight was not something I was able to integrate as a child, this sort of defensive mechanism sort of blew it out of consciousness. But I repeatedly again and again kept doing that. So yeah, I was kind of fascinated in answering that question.
From a very young age.
From a very young age.
Wow, that's amazing, I think.
And then when I was a teenager, I was actually babysitting for my little sister. I was watching a program called Stars at Night with someone called Patrick Moore, who's a sort of famous astronomer used to be on British television. And he was describing how the Earth was going to end with I can't remember the actual progression, but there's a progression where the sun becomes a sort of a white giant, and then it becomes a red dwarf, and then it becomes a black hole. And as he was describing this, then he said, and then the Earth will no longer exist. So I was sort of following this. And when he reached that point, again, there was just this sense of intense dissolution that I experienced. And this huge question arose in me, which was, how do you make sense and meaning out of life when in actuality, everything is destined to disappear, to dissolve.
Oh, okay. So right away, you were grappling with the big questions of impermanence, and especially when you were watching that show and you saw logically that it made sense, I think. And so if everything's going to go away, why bother?
It became a kind of orientation in the background. I kept seeing the doing of things or things that were done. I kept seeing them as fundamentally destined to disappear. So, I kept seeing the end story as opposed to the middle part of the story. I kept seeing the dissolution as opposed to the manifestation. And that was constantly with me. It didn't scare me particularly, but it was an orientation. And then I noticed whenever I was in busy places, I would hear this tremendous silence. So the busyness, the noise would move into the background, and this tremendous sense of silence would move into the foreground. And it had a quality of timelessness there. I knew that that silence is there before all of this that I could experience arose, and I knew it would remain after.
Okay.
So in many ways, I was kind of subconsciously being nudged more and more towards, contemplative life, really, without me knowing anything about it. I mean, in those days, there were only 2 or 3 books around, Ram Dass and that was about it. Ram Dass and Alan Watts. That was about all there was.
Sure, absolutely. There was none of this. We do live in a time where we are very fortunate because we have access to so many Buddhist teachers and resources. I wonder, was it confusing for you because it was different than maybe what everyone around you was saying, doing, experiencing?
Well, it wasn't particularly confusing for me, no, because I've always instinctually trusted the process.
Okay.
So, and trusted the rightness of it. And I was training as a photographer, so it was all part of this kind of process of looking and exploring the world at the time, and seeking clarity. And then at the age of 19, I went on my first meditation retreat. I won't describe how I ended up there, but I ended up in this meditation retreat.
Okay.
And I was taught quite a lot of sort of Tai Chi type of exercises. And without me having any cognizance or not sort of knowledge of what was about to happen, I had a major kind of Kundalini experience. That's what's generally called Kundalini experience. I mean, Kundalini is just one word for describing what I would simply describe as this huge vitality that exists within everybody.
Okay.
There's a vital force in all of us, a vital force of being that has a tremendous amount of energy. And we have this, we have this developmental task of trying to draw close to it and integrate it into our lives. And fundamentally for me, this is what, the whole Buddhist journey is about. But what it did do was it, just by way of giving you some indication of how intense it was, I lost about 1 stone in weight in 5 days.
Wow.
And it was quite otherworldly. I had no clue really what was happening. But again, I trusted the process. It was like I had steel girders being driven down through my brain. And this has been a process that's been with me ever since that day. And so that also really was the culminating experience that resulted in me seeking training, going to monasteries. So I lived in Edinburgh, and there was a very, very good Buddhist society at the university, and they brought in some amazing monks. I mean, Tortang Tolku, always remember him. And then I met this Western monk, Ajahn, who had been trained as a Marine, and he was the first Westerner I'd ever met who I felt was embodying something that I knew I hadn't encountered before in other Westerners. And so, one thing led to the other, and I ended up ordaining in the Theravada Forest tradition that was founded by Ajahn Chah, and brought to the West by Ajahn Sumedho.
Yes.
And I was ordained in that tradition for 15 years.
And you were staying still in the United Kingdom area? There was a monastery there. Did you go to Thailand or any place else?
Well, they were 4 monasteries in the UK and 2 in Europe. So I stayed in all the European monasteries.
Okay, beautiful.
But I was the longest ordained monk never to have gone to Asia, which in some ways is fitting because I was always looking to the West. And I got quite deeply into Jungian psychology, archetypal psychology, particularly the work Dr. Robert Moore, who was a professor of psychology and religion at Chicago, a
Mm-hmm.
very, very amazing teacher. And I became very interested in that because it fitted so well with the Buddha's teaching on the 5 indriyas, or the 5 spiritual powers. So he was doing this work on the quaternio, what he called king warrior magician lover, or queen warrior magician lover.
Okay.
And the sort of pyramidal forms, so the shadow forms of each of these, what he called archetypes that are kind of hardwired into the psyche.
Mm-hmm.
And this fits with the Buddhist teaching on the indriyas, which is faith, energy, mindfulness, serenity, and
Thank
wisdom.
you. I was wondering, I knew that you must have found a link between them. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been important to you in your time as a monk and now. And so I appreciate you explaining what you found, how they linked together.
Well, in fact, it kind of, the power of it was such that it actually went through the entire monastery. The entire monastery was very influenced by this, because suddenly we had a way of looking at this 2,500-year-old teaching on the indriyas and comparing it with this sort of very modern psychological language, rooted in understanding of images and film and all the rest of it. And the combination of these two things has led to a great sort of enriching process, not just for me, but I think for a lot of the people who have understood the kind of importance of this.
Now, as you say that, it reminds me of how the spread of Buddhism, across all the various countries, sometimes can be attributed to the ability to integrate with existing thought processes and systems.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we are moving towards what there's a phrase that's been coined by the scholar who put this together, and this is becoming a kind of an Indian and sort of an accepted paradigm, that we're moving towards an interspiritual age.
Okay. Yeah.
Of interspirituality. That is where all the traditions retain and maintain their uniqueness, but at the same time, there's a common understanding that there are these technologies of awakening that facilitate actual transformation within these traditions, and those technologies of awakening are pretty much the same across the board.
No matter what we call it,
no matter
different ways to get to it.
Yeah,
different ways to get to it.
I've always, in a sense, followed quite an idiosyncratic and individual path, but at the same time, always do my best to be true to what I believe the Buddha was actually teaching, and sort of trying to sort of break through some of the incrustations of understanding sometimes that I feel actually weren't serving people necessarily completely or that well. Yeah.
So it would seem that you had a teacher who understood you in a way to allow you to have your idiosyncratic way of being.
The community had a kind of network of senior monks. I was kind of in the second wave, but the first wave was about 12 or 15 monks.
Okay.
So and there was a couple of senior nuns as well. So they were my teachers in totality. I wasn't really focused on any one teacher.
Not one. You didn't have one senior teacher assigned to you, but you had an access to a community of senior teachers.
Yeah, and just the living of this life under the umbrella of Vinaya, which is the kind of discipline that the Buddha set up, facilitating the intensification of life force. Just the living of life within that container is a great education in and of itself.
That makes sense. That makes complete sense, which is why I think overall the Buddha was really emphasizing that way of life. And I don't think that the teachings say if you're outside that way of life, you can't move forward. But I do think there's a thought that you will be able to have more growth and move more quickly towards enlightenment should you choose that path. So
yeah, well, I can report on both sides of the equation.
Yes, you're both sides. So what do you think?
So, I had one monk say to me I was committing spiritual suicide when I disrobed. So
ouch.
That's one extreme. And I think that's an expression of a kind of fundamentalism within the tradition. I don't feel that my spiritual, you could say, life or progress has been in any way diminished by leaving. Obviously, what I do encounter is the difficulties just of, paying my bills and all the rest of it, and not having the support of community, etc., etc. But it's given me more freedom in a way to consolidate, I guess, the individuality of
your practice,
my sort of interpretation.
I'm sure it's not a decision you made lightly. It doesn't sound like it was a decision you made lightly when you took the robes. And I imagine when you put them down, that was also not a decision you made lightly. These are big life decisions.
No, it's a very complicated story, but there were a lot of forces in play that led to my disrobing, and a lot of them were in the collective. They were not, particular to me. I mean, I could have stayed, but in a sense, I was just responding to the direction of travel that the sort of, that I felt I was being pushed by things larger than my personal concerns.
And in the middle of all of this, that's I'm like really shortening everything because there's a lot there, right? But in the middle of all of this, you're deepening in your practice and you're building on what I feel like you were born with, or certainly aware of earlier in life than most people. And that was the impermanence of all things and beings. And who am I really? What is all of this?
Yeah, well, there's what you might call the long body, which is the view of impermanence based on the idea that, we all understand that at some point in the future when we're, 100, we'll probably have passed away. That's the long body that projects into the future. But then there's the immediacy of what's going on in the moment. What is the moment?
Right.
And, now we're kind of getting down to the crux of, what really is of interest to me. You hear a lot of people talk about be here now, or you just be in the moment, or whatever. But, it's often quite fatuous, because when they say that, they often sound like they know what they're talking about. But nobody really knows what the moment is. And if I ask you what the moment is, more likely than not, your mind's going to go blank and then kind of reach for some sort of something that you can remember that maybe describes it. But actually describing what the moment is from the point of view of the immediacy of your experience of it, the moment is mind-blowing. I mean, that's what it is. The moment is an encounter with the totality of the universe as is. So obviously the moment is, or to know the moment is to be in as a direct relationship with the universe as is, as you can possibly be, without deviation, without sort of reaching either forward or backwards.
So it's not me constructing an answer to your question, like you were very kind right then, and you didn't say like, so tell me, Margaret, what is the moment?
Yeah.
Because then I would have started constructing something. I would have said, well, It's this moment when you said the question, but that's already trailed away. Oh, it's this moment where I'm trying to answer your question, but that's already trailing away. And I feel like what you're saying, and I know you're going to help me with this, is that you talked earlier about having that experience of being out in the middle of the big, crowded, loud city, but you knew there was this silence, and you were in touch with that silence. And that silence was really what was really there. And that was the real thing that was really there. Now when you're talking about like, being in the moment, is it that being in touch with that silence?
Well, I think I've got a deeper understanding of it now. It's more than that. I mean, the silence and the experience of that silence was a glimpse of something true and real, but it was not, it was not a fully kind of mature insight. And I don't claim to have reached an endpoint either. I do believe that, if the universe is anything, and if the reason for birth is anything, it's for ongoing process of enrichment. So, I don't think that process ever ends, because if there were an end, then that's going to be disappointing. If this infinity of potential that on an impossibility of infinite exploration. So one of the simple ways that it was always described, and this brings us to the theme of birth and death, was arising and passing away. And that arising and passing away is not really a sequence, but it's instantaneous. They kind of happen together. And that, to me, is what death is, in a sense, because when that ignition happens, then in a sense you know yourself as greater than the egoic self, and the
greater
egoic
than the
self
ego,
is
greater than the
sublimated.
shell.
It's sublimated. It's not annihilated. We're not trying to get away from the ego, but it enters into a relationship with its true self. What Jung discussed was this idea of ego self axis. Okay, so that's very, very interesting, because sometimes when we think of death, or even death in the context of being a Buddhist, we think, well, the body dies, and then then I go into this kind of sphere of light or something, that somehow the realm of freedom from suffering is separate from this realm. So you kind of get this separative kind of way of looking at things.
Go from one place to the other.
Yeah.
Potentially. And I might go to the place of no suffering, or I might come back. Whereas
what this is saying, what I would suggest is that, this kind of human self or manifest self, and your you could say your immeasurable self, they're in a constant process of relationship, and that the whole process of relationship exists as a mechanism for facilitating depth, more and more increasing depth, and stimulating it, and ensuring that it occurs. And one of the things that ensures that depth occurs from this side is death. Loss of loved ones is can have such an overwhelming impact that it breaks down the kind of parameters of what we might regard as our normal world or normalized world. It kind of breaks it down. It shatters it. I've seen this happen again and again. And so there's this breaking down and this incredible impact on the heart, which is grief.
Yes.
Like a spear, that just gets thrown into your heart. And it helps facilitate this awakening of the heart. And a lot of this is often omitted in the teaching of Buddhism, but in the 4 foundations of mindfulness, every foundation, the admonition is, centering one's attention at the center of the chest. So, that's where it all kind of...
Where it all comes together. Definitely.
It all comes together.
Definitely. I have heard other people describe it as, in a way similar to you, is that it's like your heart breaks open. Your heart becomes so full that there's no other choice but then for it to break wide open. And it's in that breaking wide open that, if we allow it, we have the growth, we have the increased compassion for ourselves and others. If we allow it, I mean, definitely there are people who are closed off to the experience, but those people aren't even listening to us talk.
No, but I mean, it's all a question of, it's an initiation, but you can have failed initiations. They can go badly wrong. So the initiations that work tend to be stewarded by somebody who understands the process and can help educate you, in a sense, through the process. So, this doesn't necessarily happen by accident. For example, the whole monastic training is just basically designed to keep you, in a sense, on the meditation mat. So there's no escape.
Right.
So there's, you can't resort to alcohol, you can't resort to food, you can't resort to sex, you can't resort to, traveling, you can't, you're just stuck with it. So this is why the Buddha's teaching on patient endurance is so central. That is the one thing before the Patimokkha, which is the sort of the chanting of the entire discipline. Every full moon and every new moon, he would just say, Kanti paramang taputitika, patiently bearing with what you're experiencing is the supreme practice. And that's what we don't struggle. That's what we struggle with. We can't bear with what's occurring. But if we were to bear with what's occurring, then we are tuning in to the death process, in a sense, the arising and passing away. We get this ignition of this other thing, which is the knowing of the arising and passing away, in that stillness. Somatically, throughout your entire body, there's a whole process quite that, we could discuss if you want, where literally, you come into alignment, or you facilitate that attunement. You get the rubber to meet the road through basically those foundations of mindfulness that the Buddha teaches in conjunction with the breath. But the Buddha wasn't teaching mindfulness of breathing through the nose. That's another, I think, error that a lot of Theravada teachers are making.
Oh, will you expand on that? Because that is such a popular teaching.
Yeah, I think it's wrong.
Okay.
I don't think there's anything to do with what the Buddha was teaching.
Okay. What would you think would be so you're teaching me from scratch, let's say, and I've been indoctrinated in the, watch the breath, feel it through the nostrils, feel it in and out. So definitely. And yeah, I have sat that way. What would you teach me?
Well, first of all, if I were to teach you, I would probably start with lying down.
Okay.
Lying down, knees up, just to reduce the body pain, so you can begin to tune into the subtlety of what I believe the Buddha was pointing to.
Okay.
Fundamentally. So what I would teach you, I generally, it's based on pointing out instruction. So it's quite detailed pointing out instruction. And for example, we would take, say, just the sensation of your two fingers touching together.
Okay.
It can be any sensation, basically, because it's all one fundamentally.
Sure.
And then I would start teaching you just to notice the very subtle changes in sensation that occur as you breathe in and out.
Okay.
The tingling, the subtle tingling. And then I would get you to explore with eyes closed, for example, the nature of that sensation, in the sense of how big is it?
Okay.
Where does it begin? Where does it end?
Mm-hmm.
I would then ask you to see if you can see a point of separation between, say, your thumb and your finger in the sensation, not conceptually, but experientially. We're learning to trust direct experience here. So I'm beginning to put you more and more into the sensation. I'm going to ask you, what is the measure of the sensation? Can you find an end to it? Is the sensation, can you find an enter, or is it without end? Then I'm going to ask you to experience the sensation that you can feel outside of your two fingers touching, the space surrounding them. And can you feel in that subtle breath, there is a flow. It's a very subtle flow that you can feel with the air coming in through the cells. So if you imagine that your two fingers are porous, and that as you breathe in, that there's, in a sense, you can feel that what's being called the inner breath passes through from the outside to the inside. And as you breathe out, it passes from the inside back out. Then I go through the same process again with you, like sensing through your two fingers the space in which they're situated. How big is that space? How far does it extend? Is it up or down? Is it round or square? All of this. And then the sort of the mind-blowing one is, can you discover in your actual experience a point of separation between what you would commonly understand to be the inside of your fingers and the outside? And once you've sort of established that sensitivity, obviously you can't discover a point of separation between in and out.
I can't. And
you're feeling then you're beginning to feel a kind of a quality of expansion. And this is the jitta that you.
Okay.
So you're beginning to feel the quality of expansion, and then you can begin to, it goes on from there. So that's the entry point. What you basically do is you go through your entire body doing that. And so you end up with this whole body breath. So in a sense, we can get to the point where you can say, feel the sensation at the top of your head, feel the sensation at the tip of your toes. Can you find a point? How big is that? How small is that? How far does that go? So you just end up with this whole breathing body of sensation. And your breath becomes more refined, and your focus on the breath is established as through the cells, and then by extension, you can do that same contemplation with anything physical. So the chair you're sitting in, you actually discover the chair you're sitting in has exactly the same characteristics as a sensation as the interior sensation of your body. So you suddenly discover that everything, in a sense, you become established in this field of aliveness. So, I've taken people who've been practicing for 30 years through this process, and they've come to me afterwards and said, God, I'd never understood this before until now. And you can literally facilitate this in about 20 minutes, as opposed to people coming in off the street, sitting cross-legged with painful knees, being told to breathe in, breathe out, and watch their minds and just endure a lot of difficulty without really much reward.
I have seen people encounter that as a barrier, and it depends on who they're sitting with. I've seen different responses, right? There's kind of that like, suck it up. This is part of it, get over the knee pain thing, to, well, let's find another way to be comfortable. But yes, I do think that sometimes there's too much focus on this is the right exact way to be sitting. And if you're not doing this, then it's all over for you. And
I don't believe
I don't think the Buddha taught that.
What I think the Buddha taught was, I think he taught, Ānāpānasati, that just take the etymology of the word. Ana has roots in the idea of Atman, also atmosphere or ether or vapor sphere. So you've got all these connotations coming from the word Ānāpānasati. Pana comes from the idea of pranas, so the electricity of being, as Madame Blavatsky would have called it, or holy wind, as the Navajo Indians would have called it, or ruach, as the Kabbalistic traditions would have called it, kundalini in the Hindu traditions. It's all the same thing. And then sati is being present to. So Ānāpānasati, in a sense, is being present to the electricity of the ultimate, or being present to the holy wind. Just take the word itself. It's not saying be present to the breath coming in through your nose. That's not what it's inferring. It's much bigger than that. People aren't being served well by just being taught the breath meditation without this deeper instruction. Sure, there's what you might call the outer breath, but it's the inner breath that the Buddha's teaching about. Because then he goes on, having established that mindfulness of tension at the center of the chest, then establishing the mindfulness of breathing in this way, you contemplate the body both internally and externally. If you look at the scripture, that's actually what it says. And I never really understood for many years what they really meant by externally. I used to think, well, it's just a mistranslation. I just ignored that. Because you tend to think when you're practicing, it's all about what's inside of this skin more than what's outside. You don't tend to view what's outside as being of equal importance to what's inside. So how do you contemplate the body both internally and externally? Well, when you do this kind of breathing, then that starts to make sense, because
you see it.
As I intimated, you're establishing a sensitivity to both the internal and external environment. Then contemplating the Vedana both internally and externally. Well, what does that mean? You reach a point in your practice where the bird doesn't fly past you, but the bird flies through you. So you actually experience it in your body as a total sensation. And then, contemplating the jitta both internally and externally. Well, what does that mean? Well, to me, it has to do with more to do with the luminosities of the mind. You're beginning to experience luminosity both internally, but also in the objects that you're experiencing. And everything becomes porous. So the seeming solidity of the world all starts to become porous, and you get what I would describe as this intersubjectivity. So you're penetrated by things from the outside, and you're simultaneously penetrating their surface appearance from the inside out. So that helps reorientate the two big questions about what's going on: the who is on the inside, the who am I, and the what is on the outside. So the who is and the what is all starts to make sense, because then you're, in a sense, entering the stream of Dhamma, this stream of knowing where everything is informing you, continuously informing you of, you could say, its appearance and its sort of original nature simultaneously. So there's this constant relationship going on and constant deepening. So the fourth foundation of mindfulness, as you no doubt know, is the contemplation of Dhammas. So you enter into this kind of process of ongoing deepening, but at this point you experience the body is greatly expanded. You don't, just as the experience of your two fingers touching can become an oceanic experience of sensation, similarly the experience of your body is an isolated, it appears isolated when you look at it with your eyes, and when people speak to you,
but we're not.
But the interior experience is oceanic. So gradually you begin to let go of identification with the body as self. So there's this gradual sort of revolution, and identification with the body starts to become less and less as you become, in a sense, transition more and more into the luminosity of your essential nature, and that sort of, in a sense, becomes a place of rest, your true home. It's not that you're leaving or departing.
Okay.
It's just that you have a lot more options. Can you feel a lot less trapped?
Yes. Can we examine that for a little minute, if you don't mind? Okay. So I have a few questions. And the first one is, I'm wondering, as you're saying this, I'm thinking, first of all, somebody could have tried to teach me this before and I just wasn't ready for the lesson. So let's acknowledge this. Yeah. Also, I wonder, some people not teach it because they don't think some of us are ready, or do you think it's not taught because there's not an understanding?
I think it's not taught because it's not realized.
Okay. And I'm wondering that I'm certain that there are advanced people who have had the experience you're describing, but then maybe don't know how to turn around and teach it.
There's that, they're called Pacceka Buddhas, they're silent Buddhas.
Yes.
In that they've got a authentic depth of realization, but they don't have the skill
to teach it. Yeah, and maybe they don't even realize that they're on to something, they might, I can't speak for anyone because I'm not one of them. Okay, so there's that. Okay, and then as I have this experience, and I experienced the luminosity, then I'm thinking this is what helps me to really grasp and do and become more comfortable with my overall impermanence, and also letting go the sublimation of the ego.
Sure. In a way, like the grit that creates the pearl and the oyster, the universe is always going to keep intensifying the opportunity to continuously deepen your capacity to find that refuge. And this is what, essentially, to me, this is what wisdom is when you're faced with something that seems opaque and dense and overwhelming and, beyond tolerable. It's the ability to take that and see the space in it, to see the freedom in it, through going through fundamentally this exactly the same principles as I sort of was describing in a broad stroke earlier. So, for example, when somebody dies and you're hit with this grief that knocks you out,
right?
Which is fine. It's not that you're supposed to sort of rectify instantly with wisdom and start bouncing around being happy.
Yes, definitely.
It's that you're willing to, you have a capacity to stay present to the experience and intensity of that grief without deviation, and find some semblance of peace and release, even in the presence of something which is so seemingly unbearable. So, this is what Master Wa said. He's in your part of the world, or he was, city of 10,000 Buddhas. When asked, what have you learned from all your years of practice? He said, fundamentally, I've learned everything is okay. So what that means is, yes, you're experiencing grief, but at the same time, you're experiencing something deeper than that gives you a sense of it's okay for the grief to stay present and do whatever work it is going to do on me, which will fundamentally turn you into a more compassionate person.
And this is where I think for many of us, some of our culture outside of Buddhism works, I'll use the phrase against us, for lack of a better term, if we exist in a culture where we're taught to hide difficult emotions, to get through it as quickly as possible, to suck it up. And I think that that's where I really wanted to start talking about death, was the observation I was having of myself and everyone around me in these scenarios, and where people kind of want, hurry up and get through it type of thing. And it's not something to hurry up and get through, I believe. Right?
Exactly. And yes. We don't really have an appreciation for the stages of life.
Yes.
Particularly, but not only that, we really don't have an appreciation for you could say, the stages of consciousness that we go through as we deepen as human beings. I mean, it's not commonly understood that there are these sort of cycles of growth that we can continue to go through past just becoming a functional adult.
You've been listening to the Death Dhamma podcast with your host, Margaret Maloney. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmaloney.com, MargaretMeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.